Hello and welcome to One on One. I'm Vernon Ramesar, and I'm very pleased to say my guest today is the CEO of the ODPM and my former classmate, Dr. Stephen Ramroop.
Hi, nice
welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
Well, it's never a bad time to have you on, and as we sit here in the studio with rain falling outside, we are reminded that we are constantly faced with the possibility of natural disasters occurring.
That's correct.
And this is where you come in. You've been in the post for quite a while now.
Yes, it's about 2.5 years now. Yeah.
Have you seen any progress in terms of how the public has been sensitized?
We have measured progress by a number of qualitative and quantitative, and we were to use the quantitative ones. We did a national survey in 2011. We have approached UE, mathematics department, to do a quality analysis of the survey. But from the crude data that came from it, we realized that there are certain segments of the population, their whole opinion of what ODPM does and what a disaster is, that has changed. Then we have had a number of call-in segments in some of the appearances that we have made where we had the opportunity to hear the people talk, and a lot of them were not criticizing who we were and what we were doing, and they were actually giving us pleasant suggestions as to the way to move forward rather than criticizing the current activities that were being done by all the agencies. But one of the other key things that we noticed is we did a national drill in March of this year. And that drill incorporated all the 14 regional corporations, including Tobago. And what was pretty interesting when we did the after-action review, every single disaster corporation, including Tima and Tobago, conducted drills with their stakeholders, with their key sectors. They drilled schools, they drilled a whole village in Siparia. And you are now seeing a greater effort by the disaster units of the corporations. And many people used to mix them up. They used to say ODPM is in the village, but it was never ODPM. It was a disaster unit of the Ministry of Local Government. And that perception has also changed. People are now identifying
that was something
ODPM.
That when you first came on board, people thought the ODPM were first responders.
That's correct.
And I know that irks you because you felt people should really understand that you're a coordinating body. And that you would coordinate first responders when necessary.
That's correct.
But you are not in yourself. People don't call you to come for a fire in their house.
That's correct, because you have fire services.
Right.
You don't call ODPM because you have police. The ODPM is not the police. And you don't want to go and create another police service or another fire service or ambulance service. So we can't be first responders. But what has happened is that when I first started, we had initially thought that, ODPM would only respond when there is a disaster. And we were quite adamant about that. Something was happening. It's not a disaster. It's not declared a disaster. The corporation should be dealing with it. But what was happening is that we were realizing that we were not getting this 24-hour on this picture, and that all the agencies were segmented. They were in their own silos. So we had to have a method to bring everybody together and start figuring out exactly what we really needed to do. So for example, when the tanker capsized, first of all, it capsized at that time, and it crippled the whole country. Now, it wasn't a disaster per se, but it affected thousands of lives for 8 to 10 hours. There were babies in cars that didn't have any bottled milk again because it stood so long there, and they didn't even have water to replace the milk. And they were there for over 8 hours in cars and traffic that they don't even know where to go. So information, messages to the population, being stranded in a vehicle in the hot sun for 8 hours without anybody telling you, without diversion, it was really a disaster in a sense.
Would the national blackout we had a while back, would that qualify as a natural disaster?
It was, again, it's
not a natural disaster.
So it was what we are saying now is there are certain situations that could lead to a disaster.
Right.
So you don't wait for the disaster and say, okay, call ODPM, call the Ghostbusters, we'll come. So what we had to do now, we had to take a different view of it. So we had to bring in a 24-hour situational awareness now. We had to start encouraging all the sectors to begin looking at the possibility of something happening. Now, the blackout was an exercise which could have happened when an earthquake strikes.
I was going to say that.
Is what's
it was a teachable moment in that sense.
Absolutely.
And a lot of us learned that we weren't prepared.
That's correct.
We didn't have backup batteries.
That's
well,
correct.
I mean, I was certainly prepared, but my neighbors weren't. I could tell by the doctors of their homes.
Yes.
And you think to yourself, communication is such an important thing. You don't know what's going on.
That came out of it, and what came out of it is that we had projected to the government a proposal. We had gone through a tendering process. We went through the country. We had expressions of interest. We did a tender, open tender for the country. People, made quotations, and we looked at it and we realized that we had a provider, but a foreign company with a local liaison that was able to bring to the picture a very modern tool for early warning system. Now, when the blackout occurred, that proposal was in about 4 or 5 months before. But when the blackout occurred, it allowed the government to realize that we needed to have another consideration of this proposal, because clearly what happened in the blackout, you sat in a little village or a town, you felt the blackout, if you were awake that is, and you thought, well, it's a normal blackout. Now the only way that you would know that there's a nationwide blackout is if you got a message on your phone, or somebody called you and said, hey, do you know it's a nationwide blackout? That puts a different perspective.
Well,
Criminal elements will want to look to loot.
All of your friends call all at once and ask,
right.
Did your power go too?
Good.
You tend to
Now,
figure it out.
I think this is what would have told you. That's like an early warning system. So that's why we're looking at social media now, Twitter, all of these.
Twitter became actually very important during the blackout for
That
people
is
like me who are on it.
And
because you suddenly realized what was happening.
That's an international trend now. Disaster officers now have to have the right technology, not to monitor the tweets, but the frequency and the geography of the tweets and the type of tweets and the quality of the tweets. So you don't have to go into each one, but tweet all the Facebook, all the social media tools and instruments. That is now being used collectively to look at early warning. So it's an early warning system. Just like a church bell on High Street. If I were to evacuate High Street, right, and I don't have any other technology, you call the city corporation and you go and you tell people, ring that bell. But if you ring the bell and everybody's listening to the bell and nobody knows that when that bell rings for a whole 10 minutes, you have to leave your work and go, it's useless. So education and public education is very important as a part of early warning system. You see, these things were there for years. The Indians in North America used to go up on top of the highest hills and they used to use smoke. All of these were early warning systems. Right? Some of them were cultural, some of them were scientific at the time, and we have very good scientific ones, like for example in Boston. When the authorities wanted everybody to stay in their homes, they didn't go and light a fire like the Indians, they didn't go and put it in the public media so that the criminals will hear. They sent a very nice message to all the geographically located SIMs, and they said, stay indoors, we are doing an investigation, it will be dangerous for you to come outside. After many hours, when they realized that they couldn't get the Boston bomber, right, or one of the alleged guys, what they did, they said, okay, send the message again, let them come out and be on the lookout. Use the civilization, use the population to be your eyes. And they found the guy very soon after. And the reason for that is because there's a method to give groups of people a specific message at a specific time. So if I want to evacuate Port of Spain, for example, good, let's say that there is we are hearing that we are getting some seismic activity. We had the first quake, and UV Seismic is saying, well, you know, based on what's happening, we feel that we should evacuate some of our major facilities, right? And we say, okay, or a storm is coming, or for some reason there's a bioterrorist attack in one part of the city. We need to evacuate the city because it's downwind. We need to evacuate. Yes. First of all, what we would do, we will send a message to all the security forces to preposition themselves in the right area. Then we would want to send a message to all the principals of all the schools to say, listen, we want you to get your children and we want you to march them to the savannah. Then we will send a message to all the store owners and business people to say, all your workers and everybody in Port of Spain, we want you to assemble them nice and neatly, get them out onto the street. Do not use your vehicles. Walk up north to the savannah, and buses and security forces will accompany you to the savannah, and then we take you off. Now you understand how that messaging works? If I were to send a message to everybody's SIM card, say evacuate Port of Spain, what's going to happen?
Complete chaos, as we've seen in the past.
It's going to create a grid. So early warning system, meaning that we will now be able to look at all the video feeds in the city, all the video feeds on the highway. So we are now in a position to see the tanker capsize when it capsized. Before we didn't have the cameras, we wouldn't have seen it.
But does the ODPM have that kind of enforcement authority? We
don't have enforcement. What we have is integration, collaboration, communication, you know, cursing, loving, you know, fellowship. What we try to do is use all the camaraderie type activities to encourage the sector that what we are saying is disaster risk reduction is a sectoral activity. It's not the ODPM activity. We really say, if we do have a national disaster plan. What is the national disaster plan? The national disaster plan is every sector's, private sector, home plan, all of that integrated and using a proper early warning system like the human body. The reason why we have evolved as a creature so long is because our early warning system is near to perfection. If you touch something hot, it's in the memory, you have to move your hand. If you smell something in an area that is dangerous, you move away. If your instinct shows you that there's a dangerous situation, you try to move from it. That's an early warning system. Countries have to develop systems like that, so it has to transcend at all levels.
But I mean, you have your work cut out. You mentioned we're still a developing country.
Yes.
So we have some limitations in terms of our infrastructure is not where it should be quite often. But even, and I was mentioned before the show, I was in Toronto recently for the worst rains they've ever had. Didn't seem like much to me coming from Trinidad, but it was a couple of hours to me of heavy rain like we would normally get here, and Port of Spain would flood and everything would be normal. Power went out to much of the city. The area where I was living in, power was off for 2 days. The subway system was a mess for quite a while. That tells you something, doesn't it? I mean, even a developed, highly developed city like Toronto can just fall apart.
And I think that is what the expectation of the population. We are not taking that and looking at who we are, what stage in our development compared to a country that's 150, 100 years old. We are just about 50, 51. So when you look at what's happening in our country, we're young. We haven't yet developed the systems that are robust enough to deal with our crime. Our situation with crime, for example, is evolving because the criminal elements are much more advanced than some of our current systems. The reason being is that we have not only crime, we're talking about everything, public safety, civil defense, which is what we're talking about. The patterns of the global climate, and the scientists are telling you that. They're telling you that we have climate change. But we always had climate change. From the age of the dinosaurs, climate was changing. So climate change is an ordinary thing that happens in the human life as part of this world. What we now have is climate variability. Climate variability is that they are having intense rainfall. Over 500 years of rain is falling in sometimes 3 hours. It happened in England. It's happening in Russia now, and you're seeing it all over the world. It happened in Pakistan, it happened in Australia, it happened in Toronto, and it's happening because the rain is just lingering and falling, and that is causing tremendous stresses on the current drainage systems in terms of your infrastructure. When we developed our infrastructure in some of these big cities, we didn't understand that the subway, like in New York during Sandy, was going to get flooded. And therefore, when we looked at the blackout that we had in Trinidad and Tobago, it's a lesson to say that you have two little circuits that was monitoring an engine that was running, right, in terms of the physics of it. I'm using engine as a physics word. And that failed. But you didn't have the redundancy to have a backup system. So your early warning system that was monitoring that key element that could have caused a nationwide blackout went, and it wasn't able to pick it up. Even if it picked it up, it didn't report it to a hierarchy to allow another redundancy to kick in, you see? So this is what we are looking at. In Toronto, we have quite a lot of capacity. So you would not have seen, if it were in Trinidad, it would have had a greater impact because we would not have had the resources, for example, to deal with it. Because there was a train, for example, that was evacuated by the army, right, in Toronto.
The GO train.
That's correct. Now, the thing about it is that for that to happen, you would have had a coordinated mechanism between
But that was
the
interesting
train
because that took about
and the
8
military.
hours for them to evacuate the train.
Correct, yes.
If that happened in Trinidad, the amount of criticism the authorities would get for taking 8 hours to do
You know, we went in the Diego Martin floods, the ODPM was able to, notwithstanding the cries of the politicians who came in early and they were on the ground, which we didn't advise at all because we don't want another 911 on our hand where the first group of politicians and people go in and are wiped out. So we tried to prevent that. But what we did is, even if we had that, we had backhoes and excavators, and before even the corporation was able to mobilize their people, the ODPM using its our resources and our MOUs that we had with people to get heavy equipment there, and they were actually cleaning and dredging, right, about 4 to 8 hours after the impact. And I mean, the population probably wouldn't have seen that because that was the positive end. What we tend to see is the negative things. But I tell you what we saw. What we saw that when the military was assisting certain communities to clean their homes and to clean the dirt from all the rubble from their porches, young men were sitting in some of those porches playing cards in their own homes that we were cleaning. Now that to me sends a very, very good big signal. It tells me that here you have the military cleaning your own home, and some young, strapped young men are playing cards and smoking cigarettes on their own porches.
because they're so apathetic.
Is it? Now what that tells you is that our society needs to really evolve. And you ask me the question, are we ready? Judging from when I started in ODPM to now, I am saying that yes, in a lot of the high-risk communities, that we have a better perspective of our disaster. We understand a little more. Our early warning systems are becoming more robust. They're becoming more first world. So we are developing all of those. But you know, fundamentally, if the human soul in the homes, they don't understand and appreciate their role in what has to happen, right, then we're in some problems.
Because, I mean, as any of the recent events will teach us, is that if you can't in some way help yourself,
That's correct.
you're going to have to wait an awfully long time in terms of triage for the emergency service to get to you.
Let's make an appeal, for example. Let's make an appeal. In this program, I want to encourage all the viewers here. If you have had a previous episode where your house was flooded, or your roofs were blown off, or galvanized was blown off in a heavy wind, or a landslide in the area affected you somewhere in terms of accessing your home, or even coming close to your fence, or your fence was running down in a river. If you live next to a river, if you're a person who lives in an unregulated settlement next to a river bank, or you're not, you're what we call squatting in Trinidad, right? If you're living in any one of those areas that are not developed or town and country approved, if you live above 300 meters or you have a building that is over 300 feet high, all of these are very high risk areas. Let me ask you a question. We want you to get what is called a shelter in place arrangement. Find a relative, a friend, a neighbor, or any one of your associates that you have had in the past who live in a more safer area, higher ground, good drainage. Find them first, so that if we have 500 people in a community and I have to evacuate all of those persons who have had a previous episode like that, let us say that once a storm is coming, let's say next 2 days we have a storm in the Atlantic, and although the storm is moving north, we are advised that we have a 40% chance of getting the storm surges and the heavy weather bands. What do I have to do? I have to evacuate all the persons who have had those same experiences, because we know with the incessant rain, like what happened in Toronto, that they're going to be flooded, no matter what kind of drain you have.
Whereas if they had taken some measures to move themselves out of the situation.
Shelter in place, you go, you call your, when we come down with the police officers and the big trucks and the fire officers, we say, do you have shelter in place? Yes, I want to go by my nanny, I want to go by my uncle. Where do they live? So we move you aside and we get you out. Why? Because our shelters that are supposed to have 5,000 will only have about 100 people who don't have anywhere to go. And that means it puts less burden on the state. But not only that, when you have your young daughters in the shelter, when you have your issues to deal with as a female, when you have different people sleeping close to each other on a bunk,
there's dangers inherent,
as
we saw during
try
Katrina.
to prevent that. Yeah. So shelter in place is where we encourage the whole of Trinidad and Tobago. Have an alternative arrangement wherever you live. Find someone else who can take you. Even in villages that we visited, in some of the flooded areas, some of the people were living on flats and they were in the floodplains, whereas other persons built 2-story homes and they were upstairs. So that even if you look at that, you can ask your neighbor, well, neighbors, if I do have some flood, could I just get a room just for a few days, because be nice to your neighbor. That also helps with social and crime as well,
Now, you were mentioning that you're part of a new global platform through the UN, I believe.
Well, it's a platform that was created by the United Nations, right? United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Risk Reduction, based on what was happening in 2005 in the globe, what was happening in the Indian Ocean in 2004 with the tsunami. So what had happened is that they realized that all the countries had to come together to decide after what was happening in terms of in Japan and Hyogo. They came up with what is called the Hyogo framework. So all 168 countries of the United Nations signed an agreement that we must introduce and implement these activities within our countries so that we can make our countries resilient, our schools safer, our hospitals safer, build community resilience, let people know about disasters, educate the public. So all of what we are doing, every single thing that we are doing, were part of the mandate of all governments that signed that agreement.
And this is science-based, obviously.
This is where all countries come together. You have scientists, politicians, technical persons, councillors, mayors, private sector. They come together for what is called a global platform in Geneva every 2 years. This year, in 2013, we had a platform, and what they asked us to do was to focus on the private sector, focus on the science of disaster risk reduction. Tell people what is happening with respect to the science. Go down to the villages and find out your differently abled people. In a street, ask the social services to identify who are differently abled, because they are dying. In every single disaster in the world, almost 50% of the differently abled people die, more than 50%.
Because they're least able to help
because
themselves.
They're least able to help. You run out of a building, you leave the person with the stroke, you leave the person with the cerebral palsy.
Disoriented blind person.
Of course, and single parents, gender, females are more affected than children. They are the ones that die the most in disasters. So when you look at all of these facts, it means that our programs must cater for that. So we have reached the stage where now we have core communities organized and ready for emergencies, phase 3. With phase 3 now, we're going into every single village that have, first of all, with high risk. We're going to map every single home. We're going to find out who are differently abled, who are, who are elderly, right, who have serious risk problems, which house is actually very risky. So in other words, then we can actually have a map, and the disaster management units of the corporation, they are the ones that are supposed to lead that charge. We will facilitate it by resources, bring the Red Cross together, bring the Rotary Clubs together, bring the community centers together, bring the church leaders together, and then what we will identify is what we call early warning points. Each village, each town will have about 15 or 20 early warning points spread across the regional corporation. And these people will be given radios, they'll be taught how to use it. They will be asked to call us back and let us know if you see the water in the river is rising, because you're living there, you will know when it's going to flood. If you see something is changing, if you feel the shake, if you see something is happening, you call back to the corporation and they will contact us. And we have a 24-hour center up and running now called the National Operations Center, and that will be able to take your call. So before something is happening, as it's unfolding, within the next 6 months, the ODPM with the National Operations Center that will have security issues as well, we'll be able to have a better picture of what is going on, and we'll be able to send early warning messages, as we told you, in a geographical sense. So you don't have to send a message to you, and if you're vacationing in Toronto and we're sending it down to where your problem is in your area, you're getting it in Toronto.
So if you get flooding in Diego Martin,
it's geographically going to be sent, and it's going to be sent in groups, so that every group, so before we even want to evacuate you, the police will get it, the army will get it, the fire service will get it, the ambulance will get it, the hospitals will get it. So everybody's ready there now, and then we say, okay, Chief, we want you to leave and go to your health center, or we want you to go to your shelter, or we want you to go to your shelter in place if you can. If you can't, assemble at the church next to you over the road by the Kentucky or whatever, and we send a big van for you, put your family in it, pack your disaster bag, and we take you to your shelter in place. Now that is basically how we will do it.
And as part of this thrust, they also, of course, did risk assessments on individual member countries.
That's correct.
And we often, God is a Trinity, the things that you have to listen to all the time. Yes, the fact is we are less likely to get a hurricane because of our position geographically. But earthquakes are a very real possibility. And us getting a really disastrous one, as we saw in Haiti, is also a very real possibility.
It is actually real. The fault in the central fault, where the hospital, the big debate on whether the hospital should be built or should not be built, that fault has the possibility. It hasn't been scientifically shown because they're doing the studies. But if it's an active fault, that could give us a 7.1, and that could create a lot of havoc, like in Haiti. One of the
and we're on the junction of several fault lines.
That's correct. That's correct. I mean, we can be impacted by any one of the earthquakes in the region and the volcanoes, and that can cause tsunamis. So we are not out of the woods. What was pretty interesting about the platform in this year is that they brought out what is called the Global Assessment Report. And if any one of the persons interested, in the audience wants to go and look at GAR report, just Google Global Assessment Risk, GAR 2013, and download the executive copy of that document. It can be used by banks, it can be used by media, it can be used by everyone. And in it, there's some lovely documents in terms of graphs and telling us now. When we first started in ODPM, we had a lot of problem collecting data. We are currently doing an IDB project, funded project, where we're looking at collecting data from all the sectors, because data gives you evidence that allows you to make decisions. When we first started, a lot of the evidence coming out of Trinidad were fragmented in silos, and some of them were not validated, and they were improper data, wrong data. It gave the wrong impression of Trinidad. In 2013, after improving the data collection, data analysis, data transfer, data mining, data warehousing, the whole data management system, in terms of disaster risk, we have come a long way from the ODPM and all the sectors. So we can now feed the global platform, scientists through the World Bank, IDB, and a lot of key sectors, the actual data that we are getting in Trinidad and Tobago. So even if it's still not very good, it still gives us a better picture of where we were than when I started in 2011.
Which, of course, is essential for good decision making.
That's correct. And now what has happened? Out of that crude data, although it is better than 2011, we now have them telling us that we are one of the countries with the highest risk for earthquakes in a 1 in 250 year return, meaning that we now have to go to the population. They have told us that because of our private sector data coming out from the economy of Trinidad and Tobago in terms of our oil and natural gas and our thousands of private sector companies that are evolving out of our oil and energy-based industry, that we stand the highest risk of losing our capital investment that we put in over the last 20 years, and we can actually become a middle, low-income country in 5 years after the disaster, because we will topple, because a lot of our small businesses will go out.
Well, that's cheery news, isn't it?
No, that's fun. That is something that we are afraid because
right.
we have now to go and tell the private sector, listen to me. All the time we thought that ODPM and the ministry and all of us have to do our part. What we're finding out is that businesses that are not able to get back on their feet within 3 to 4 months will fail. And that you can't, for example, if your ports cannot stand up, big businesses abroad is not going to use your port. If your airport is not going to move the flights that it's supposed to move, the Coopers and they're not going to come to you again. They're going to go somewhere else. So which means that it'll take you a very long time to get back to where you were. So you have to build this resiliency and you have to build this anti-fragility, we are using in the words now, the whole anti-fragility mechanisms that evolve around your companies to allow you to stand up. If you were to have an earthquake, and IETV cannot come back in the air, right, after 3 months, you're going to have trouble. You're going to have trouble.
Yeah.
So therefore, you are an essential part of this whole thing, right, information feed. So therefore, things like satellite communications, the ability to have sat internet, so even if you can't actually generate, if you're related anywhere to the Cumberland antennas on the Cumberland Hills, we have to have the Army go and secure that facility. We have to have contingency plans to go and well back up and get back Cumberland Hills in order, because that is one of our first
It'll be one of the first things to go in a hurricane.
That's
in any
correct.
case. Yeah.
So we have Cumberland Hills and we have Central Range. It goes in a hurricane and it also goes in an earthquake. So access to it is also a problem, because in the Diego Martin and in the northern rains that we had recently, one of the problems we had was to justify for payment to the Ministry of Finance why we spent all that money to get access to the Cumberland Hills. But it's a hard thing to tell people that if you have no access to Cumberland Hills and those antennas go down,
you've lost communication
your big media houses are going to go.
Dr. Ramroop, we're completely out of time, but certainly you have me more worried than I was before, which I know, given your job, is actually a good thing.
It's
a good thing to be prepared and to have a realistic idea of what really could happen potentially. Thank you so much for being on the program.
Nice being here.
Thank you very much. You've been watching One on One. Join us again tomorrow for another edition.